Welcome to our webinar about the EU medium-term economic outlook and how vaccine and policy developments fuel optimism. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce and in collaboration with the European Union delegation to the United States and with the Business Council of International Understanding and the World Affairs Council of America. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC New York, and I will be your host and moderator for today. Today's webinar will analyze how the European Union is faring as we're making our way towards the recovery. And in the light of the EU-funded recovery plan, vaccine rollout, slower in some regions, faster in others, and now that we have a Brexit deal on the books. According to our economic experts and frankly on our own experience as well at the EACC, there are good reasons to be optimistic about the future. While the second wave of the pandemic will inevitably delay the recovery a little bit, there are green shoots beginning to show, and the outlook for the second half of 2021 almost looks rosy. With that said, the pace of the recovery will obviously depend on fiscal and monetary policies. The EU-funded recovery plan will play a major role in reviving the economy and preparing Europe for new challenges and opportunities, and we will address that in the next hour. Our panelists include Ben Carlina. He's the senior economist at the EU delegation to the US, and he focuses on macroeconomics, emphasizing on monetary and fiscal policies. Chris Orsini is the Counselor for Economic and Financial Affairs, also at the EU delegation, and he's in charge of US economic and economic policy developments, transatlantic economic relations, and the relations between the EU and the multilateral financial institutions here in the US. Ben is going to start us out on the conversation, and I hand it over to him.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to basically run through sort of where we are and what's been going on in the European economy over the past few months. I'm going to try to keep it quick because I'll turn it over to Chris afterwards, but then I hope you guys have some questions ready because I'd like to have a good discussion. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. Just as in the United States, it's been pretty similar overall dynamics in Europe. We had this big increase in infections, and part of this was probably caused by the introduction of new variants that are, more communicable and harder to get a handle on. And the fact that it happened over the winter holiday season made the impact on the economy a little bit worse than it might otherwise have been, because there's typically lots of holiday shopping and entertainment that was restricted because of the containment measures. One thing to note, if you look at this chart, things never got quite as out of hand in Europe as they did in the United States because of the containment measures. And secondly, new infections are now falling. So maybe we can move to the next slide and we can look a little bit at the containment measures. In response to the new increase in infections, it varies across country, but in general, European countries instituted stricter containment measures than the United States did. But on the other hand, not quite as strict as in the first wave of the pandemic in the spring. And I think that there have been some lessons learned, and the containment measures have been a bit more targeted, and maybe people have come to understand how to deal with them a little bit better, because there has been a big economic impact from the measures, both in the fourth quarter of last year and continuing on into the first quarter of this year. But it's not looking like it's as sharp a shock as we experienced before. So, now you can see we're looking back at the GDP figures from 2020. And of course, there was this huge shock in the second quarter when it initially hit, followed by this big bounce back in the third quarter. But then in the fourth quarter, because of the reemergence of the pandemic, we had activity slow down again. Now, having said that, the hit to economic activity was not as bad as people were initially expecting. On a quarterly basis, GDP fell 0.7% in the euro area and 0.5% in the broader EU. And to translate that to American on a Q4 over Q4 basis, so more like the annual numbers that you're used to hearing, the declines were 5.1 and 4.8% respectively. Now, of course, these are aggregate figures, and so they mask some of the differences across EU countries. Obviously, countries that had strict lockdowns and also, particularly large tourism sectors fared a bit worse than others. The goods producing sectors, haven't had a huge impact. And in fact, compared to pre-pandemic levels, they've already fully recovered. So that's pretty solid in terms of, how the economic activity has been affected. The goods producing sectors are really pretty good. And just like in the States, it's the businesses that rely on a lot of in-person activity that have taken the biggest shot. One thing I'd also like to note about these numbers, so the Q4 numbers aren't great, better than expected. In Q1, you'll also see lingering effects because of the lockdown measures, but just the fact that you've had these containment and lower growth means that there is pent-up demand in Europe, and when we do reopen, it means that the recovery should be, that much stronger. So let's move on to a little bit about fiscal. Like in the U.S., a lot of fiscal firepower has been brought to bear in order to limit the impact of the pandemic and to make sure that people have enough money to pay their bills and whatnot. You can see that in 2019, we had, an aggregate general government deficit across the euro area of we don't have the number, 0.6% in the EU last year. And that went up to over 9% in the EU and over 12% in the euro area. So there's been a really big fiscal impact, fiscal effort. And one thing I'd like to point out when you're thinking about this in comparison to the US, you see these really big headline numbers for all the discretionary spending that we've been doing in the US with, direct checks and fiscal transfers and extended unemployment benefits. And in the EU, because the social safety net works better and is already existing, there's been less need for discretionary measures, and these automatic stabilizers, as we like to call them, kicked in and provided a lot of the initial support. Having said that, on top of that, there have been a lot of new stuff, and Chris is going to talk about the recovery fund later on. But I think that while it is true that the US has had a bit more, and especially if we get this 1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus or whatever that Biden is pushing through, there will be a bit more fiscal support in the US, but still it's unprecedented levels of support in the EU as well. And there's been quite a bit that's happening. And so maybe if we can go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about one of these in particular, one of the automatic stabilizers that's had a really big impact. That's the short work schemes. We've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, the short work schemes have done an incredible job at keeping unemployment levels from shooting up. In the US, if you're looking at the red line, the headline unemployment rate hit almost 15%, and that probably understates the true level of unemployment in the US. It probably was closer to 20% when you count all the people who left the labor force and were misclassified because they were on furlough schemes. In the EU, because of these short work schemes, a lot of people managed to stay at work, and this, meant that they didn't have to be provided with the same level of direct checks or unemployment benefits as in the US, because they were already being covered by these short work schemes where the government subsidizes a percentage of their their income levels before they were put on furlough. So this has had a big impact. But I will say that never before in Europe have has there been such a substantial decrease in other measures, like, for example, the number of hours worked. And that, so the impact, the economic impact has affected the labor market very similarly. It's just the difference of these public measures like the short work schemes that you're seeing in the unemployment statistics. The number of hours worked in Europe is still about 4% below pre-pandemic levels. And again, there's big differences. It's not, if you're a factory worker, you're working probably just as hard as you were before. But if you're a waiter or working in the leisure sector, you have a lot more free time on your hands. That's one thing. But in addition to the short work schemes, there have been a lot of other measures that policymakers have taken to make sure that the economy, continues to tick over, and in particular to make sure that the corporate sector has access to credit. So the ECB started in mid-March of last year to really ramp up what it's doing in terms of its asset purchases. You can see that on the left side of your screen. And the right-hand chart shows these lending surveys that are taken both in the US, that's the red line, and Europe is the blue line. And what you see, that big spike in the red line in the US was when companies drew down all their revolving credit lines with banks because they were trying to make sure that they had enough cash to survive. You didn't see that same thing in Europe, but you have seen a more gradual increase. And this is evidence that the banks are still able to lend. Companies that need money are still able to go to their banks and access credit. And this has been partly because of the support measures from places like the ECB, but also because banks were much better capitalized than they were, for example, in the great financial crisis back in 2008. And let's go to the next slide, and you'll see that this time around, this crisis has been very different from what happened before. There has been no financial fragmentation at all in the euro area. And that, I think, is a significant achievement that, particularly for American audiences, we should look at and see how much work has been done in deepening the economic and monetary union over the past 10 years. That's what, a lot of the initial support came from ECB asset purchases and things like that. But recently we've had spreads to benchmark German bonds come down to historically low levels. And this isn't just because of the ECB, this is because of the agreements that we've reached on the next generation EU funds, the recovery package, and even more recently, the Draghi becoming Prime Minister of Italy, where people have high expectations that he's going to be able to enact some serious reforms. So sovereign spreads have come down across the board, and that's really encouraging. But it's also true that corporate spreads have come down, and you're seeing that, that's also important that businesses have been able to do that. And, not just for investment grade, but for high yield companies, they still can access credit. And so that's been really big. So maybe I should stop there. I've tried to be really quick. That's sort of a brief background of where we are. And then Chris can take us to a little more forward-looking part of the forecast.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. Hi, Yvonne. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here as usual. Just maybe one last comment on the right-hand side of this slide. You see the debt level as a share of GDP in the EU, the blue line, and in the US. But of course, the one in the EU is an aggregate, which, with the average, I would say, across all member states. And sort of the shaded area represents sort of the minimum and the maximum being the debt to GDP ratio of Italy and the minimum that of Germany. I mean, there are actually member states with lower debt to GDP than Germany, but they are very small. So just to give you a little impression of where is the average and where is the bound of variation. But we can get back to the debt issue later on. But Ben has just given us a very good, I think, overview of what happened so far, and I'm going to maybe say a few words about what we expect for the future. Starting with the PMI indexes. So PMI is basically just the diffusion index that tells the share of purchase managers that think that things are going to go well. And usually when it's above 50, it means that more than half think that things are going to go well. You have a pickup and acceleration of economic activity, and if it's below, it's bad, right? You have a contraction. And what we see here is really the very diverse picture that emerged from manufacturing and the service sector. So in the manufacturing sector, we have had a full rebound after the lockdown measures of last spring, and the situation really looks quite bright. In fact, I mean, not so long ago, before the crisis, we were talking about a manufacturing recession, that was throughout 19, a lot of sort of weakness in the manufacturing, and that is not happened. I mean, this is actually very high reading, and especially the very last reading is going up. And I mean, it also has to do with what we have observed both in the US and in the EU. As consumers are a bit more constrained in spending on services, they have shifted part of that spending on goods on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the additional savings translate into higher purchase of durables, be it a car, being some refurbishment in the house, etc. So all of this is, of course, transmitted to the output of factories, and you see this very good reading of the manufacturing. But of course, manufacturing is, nowadays is a small share of GDP. That's true across the board with some variations. And in the services, again, I mean, here it's red US, blue EU. A little bit of a difference between what's happening in the US and in the EU, in the sense that we had this big recovery after spring throughout the summer, but then as the second wave came, there's been some further weaknesses, and especially at the time of the reimposition of a lot of the restrictions, and that is a bit in contrast with the US, where in fact, as Ben said, restrictions were never measures were never so tough in a way, and that we see that the recovery is still ongoing. But I just wanted to focus here on the dotted line. The PMI indicator is aggregates and answers across a number of components, and including, for example, the backlog, or capacity utilization. And in this moment, the backlog in the service sector is very low, but other components are really sort of about future business expectations, right? And that we see that, I mean, this part is historically higher than the aggregate, this component, but it also is a little bit ahead of the rest of the index, in the sense that the rest of the index follows, and we see that there it's actually that component has recovered up to pre-pandemic level and beyond. So expectations, sort of the most forward-looking part of the PMI for services, is actually already looking, it seems, at the post-pandemic world. And why is that? And well, part of that is really because of the the success of the vaccine. And I mean, I say success of the vaccine, I say across the board. I mean, nobody really, as late as October, when we came out with our previous forecast, was expecting that there would be such a fast progress in the vaccine space and the rollout. Now here again, you see the total number of vaccine in the US and the EU, and these are the daily averages. And it's true that there has been a little bit of a delay on this front on the European Union side. And two things I think should be kept in mind is, one is that in this process, you are only as strong as your weakest link, and that is definitely true for the European Union, which is very open. You have internal mobility, etc. So there was a strategy on the European Union side to make sure that vaccines would be rolled out at a similar pace across the Union, and that centralization process probably took some time. But second, also there was, especially during summer, a lot of pockets of skepticism about vaccine that were starting to emerge, and it was a choice not to go through a very hasty process of validating this vaccine. So in a way, there were some delays in which the medical authorities approved the vaccine. So there is a bit of a backlog, but the trend is positive. I mean, I should also mention that there were some bottlenecks in the level of the distribution of the vaccine from the pharmaceutical houses. I think that has been to a large extent resolved, and what we see now in fact is that the bottlenecks are more emerging at the level of distribution. But so in fact there is more doses in a lot of member states than what is actually being injected.
And can I just add really quickly, Chris, that some of the supply shortages that you saw were because pharmaceutical companies were shutting down their factories so that they could ramp up production later on. And so there might even be some upside risk in terms of having more of a supply, by the summer.
Absolutely. I mean, this was actually also partly negotiated with the member states, that they would stop production for a couple of weeks in order to ramp it up later on. So, I mean, in a way, some of the shortfalls will be compensated by a higher delivery later on. So the technical assumption underlying our forecast exercise at this stage is that by the end of summer, we will have achieved about 70% of immunization and of the adult population, I should add, and that it will allow for a progressive unwinding of all of the restrictive measures that were put up during winter. And that will happen in a very progressive way. Let me say that again. But the expectation is that sometimes by the next year, 2022, we will back to normal when it comes to all sort of restrictions, capacity constraints, also maybe larger scale events. So this was the first piece of the picture why our outlook has actually improved. The second part is that we're looking at a much more favorable external environment than we had anticipated. And what I had in these two graphs is global growth. In blue is what we expected in autumn, and in red is what we expect now. And on the other one, it's just import dynamics. So the import of EU from the rest the import growth from the rest of the world. And what you see is that we were really expecting a contraction in 2020 to be larger, but also that the rebound in 2021 would be smaller. And that has changed largely to the extent that of course, for all of the advanced economies, we have the same story of the vaccine rollout, but also the very strong policy support that has come, and the US and what is happening on this side of the pond is of course central to that story. I mean, in pushing really up the global growth more than we expected it just a few months ago. And of course, more global growth also means more trade, and this is especially beneficial for Europe, which is a very, very open economy with respect to trade. And I would also add to that some of the hurdles that we expected in autumn, including the fact that maybe the risk of not having resolved the trade relations with the UK have taken away at this moment. So it means that the trade outlook is going to be much more favorable, and we can get back to that later. So bringing all of this together, and this is really sort of where we go to the numbers. We are looking at the rebound of this year of a short of 4%, 3.7%, and I would actually say that figure is a little bit lower than what we had before. But I think the narrative here is more important. It is lower because it's starting a bit later on, in Q2, and as Ben anticipated, Q1 is still going to be a tough one, and we're probably going to have a number of member states falling back into a technical double-dip recession. But So that brings down the growth for the whole of the year. But what is most important, I think, is that it's really this growth momentum is going to carry over into 2022 with a growth short of 4% in real terms, which means that in fact the whole of the EU should be back to pre-pandemic. The level of the economy should be back to pre-pandemic levels during 2022, which is actually a bit before what we are expecting in the previous round. Of course, there's a lot of regional variation in that, as you can see from these maps. Growth is probably going to be a little bit stronger in those economies that were hit hardest, and Spain, Greece, Croatia. Some of the one would really depends a lot on tourism here. But of course, this also mixes with a number of other sort of pre-existing condition. So maybe just to see that there are still, of course, risks to this forecast, and there are plenty of. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are plenty of downside risks. But what we see is that for the first time, we are looking at a glass that is half empty, half full. We are able to really say that this is our scenario, middle of the road, but it could actually be better as well. So that's what we call the upside risks. And that is, the vaccination rollout could come up more quickly than expected, also because we have ramped up this production. There will be, there is an excess of savings and pent-up demand, and that could really provide some very strong and momentum going forward, and both on the side of consumption and on the level of investment, especially if we're looking at more transformative kind of environment coming out of this pandemic. Last but not least, it is the next generation EU, and I would say that just one important note is in this forecast we have not really put this. Does not really include all of this package, or actually it marginally includes this package, and that is because the plans are not yet specified, and we cannot include what has not really been detailed at that level. But we do expect that there will be significant boost to GDP growth coming from the recovery and resilience package that could add some 2 percentage points of growth over the period. Here I just so try to summarize a little bit the key messages of this forecast. I leave them to you to maybe read them through so that we can move maybe to the Q&A, which is probably the more important, more interesting part of this presentation. So Yvonne, I'll leave it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you both, Chris and Ben. Very, very interesting, and we already have a couple of questions coming in. A note: we will make this available, the handout available after the program, so you can get the key takeaways. So a couple of things one question was, if you guys agree that Europe can expect a 4.2% growth at 21-22, whereas Asia may be at 6.3 and the US at 5.5. If so, what might Europe do to boost growth and attract more foreign direct investment? And if the assumption is wrong, what do you think are the predictions, looking another year out? You're on mute.
Okay, this is the story of 2020 and 2021, hopefully. We'll get over it at one point, we'll learn. So I think that once we start looking at the post-pandemic environment, we do not have to forget about the fundamentals that we are. Europe is growing a bit slower than the US, and we know the reasons for that. I mean, partly has to do with demographic, partly has to do with just the dynamism. God forbid, even try to compare that with China. That there are just these very fundamental trends there. China is really still, in some dimension, a catching up economy. So I mean, let's make sure that we still, compare. Maybe in that sense, the comparison with the U.S. is a bit more fair than the comparison with Asia, which has still a very important share of lower income economies. fiscal support that is coming from the US, as we see it, is of an unprecedented magnitude. And of course, we, as I said, this is generating very positive spillovers for Europe. So this is all good news. We have, it's baby steps maybe seen from outside. I don't think that, if you look from inside, it's probably much more transformative than that. We have come up with a fiscal stimulus package. Well, first of all, I would say that, during this period, 2020, if you look at the overall stimulus to the economy, or support, I would say, to the economy that was given from the Europe and the US, we're talking 12 percentage points in the US. We're talking 9 percentage points in the European Union. So it's still, in any case, it falls within that order of magnitude. Number one, it's clear that going into 2021, the US is really doing an experiment of trying to really accelerate the recovery. Europe has taken a bit more, maybe a conservative step in that, but the recovery and resilience facility and the Next Generation EU is quite exceptional when you look at what it will do. And as I said, you can probably add some additional growth coming once this will be fully on board, and we expected the first disbursement to happen already this year. And I would mention, just it's not just stimulus here, right? We are talking about transformative investments, especially in green, especially in digital. This has really the potential to lift the potential growth in the long term. So, behind the recovery and how fast it's happening in 21, 22, I would say Europe had a problem of lower potential growth, and that is what we are trying to address. And maybe Ben, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that point that if you think about comparing the U.S. and Europe, the American Recovery Plan that's currently making its way through Congress, this is still very much of an aid fiscal support kind of package. It's got direct checks to households, aid to states, money for public health. And on the member state level in Europe, there have been lots of measures like that already. Not quite as big, but really big in historical terms. The recovery plan is really looking at increasing the long-term potential growth rate and making the kind of structural reforms in Europe that will allow it to grow faster on a more sustainable level in the future. And so I would also, looking ahead, people also wonder if there's going to be an infrastructure package from the Biden administration in the fall, which would, of course, add even more fiscal stimulus. But I think that package is going to look a lot more like the recovery fund, because not only is it about structural transformations, but explicitly, I forget the percentage now, 25% or something has to go to green technology and okay, 20%. But what that means is that there's going to be a lot of spending in Europe on, new electrical grids, on transitioning to electric cars, which is already happening, really rapidly. And I think in the United States, people are used to thinking about, oh, how much is it going to cost to make the transition to reducing the carbon footprint of our economy? And they're not focused enough on the growth aspects. And so that, I think, at least is what people are hoping that this recovery fund can really kickstart is, a lot of investment in new green infrastructure, and that will bring private sector investment along to multiply the impact. And so, if you take a longer term view of how to get potential growth up and how to make your economy more productive, that's really what the recovery fund is aiming at.
Yeah, along those lines, we have a question. If there were specific member states that were that either over or underperformed against these aggregate figures that you had outlined before, and in this context, my question would be: so how do you expect the recovery plan to work to level the playing field across the various sectors? Because there were, Chris already said, there were some countries, Italy, Spain, that were heavily dependent, Austria too, on tourism. What is the recovery? How I mean, is the recovery plan addressing that, and how do you expect that to level out, the recovery across the member states?
So yeah, Yvonne, as you said, I mean, I think not if you looked at the range of variation across member states, how they fared in this terrible 2020 and how they're going to be recovered 2021 is quite wide. And you mentioned some of the member states that were really hit very hard. Spain, you have Italy, you have some of the economies that highly depend on tourism. I mean, tourism is one part of the story. We have seen also, the very different dynamics that we have in between manufacturing and services. So countries which have a bit of a stronger manufacturing actually fare better than those who are more heavily reliant on services. Hence the fact that Germany is probably not going to have a double-dip recession, number one. But also that's also explains partly in Italy, because whereas it is dependent on tourism, but it also still has a very strong manufacturing base. So ultimately, that's the difference, for example, with Spain. In Austria, one doesn't think about it as a very tourist-intensive economy, but it actually is. And especially if you kill off the winter ski session, it's going to have an impact on the economy. So. On top of that, there are other things that matter. It's just how effective some of those social safety network nets that Ben was describing. I mean, they all work in similar way, but they are not just all the same. And we also know that, for example, it's much more difficult to have this working in places where you have a large share of temporary contracts, where you have a lot of self-employed. These people tend to fall through the cracks. And in a way, these dislocations that you have then on the labor market amplify the shocks. So that is sort of just to try to explain why you have this divergence. But on top of that, so you also had sort of some of the pre-existing condition, and that has to do, if a country like Italy had been struggling with growth already for quite some time. The recovery, I mean, the Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility is trying to really address this asymmetric impact of the pandemic. And that is why actually it is looking at, it's a very mixed, complex formula, I should say, but it sort of looks at the overall population, but then weights that also with what happened and the impact of the pandemic on unemployment and the GDP shortfall. So what you have out of this is basically that the bulk of the money is going to be concentrated to those member states who have suffered the most, and I think this is really the change in narrative and the change in perspective and the change in understanding that has happened during this crisis, as opposed to during the great financial crisis and the Eurobond crisis, is that there were no guilty member states and virtuous member states, right? We are all in this together, and on top of that, we really are in this together because not only because of the interconnection of the economy, but also because of the risk of not addressing a virus in one member state and letting it multiply and variations, etc., in another member state. So I think this is the realization, and it's not always the sort of the sinners of yesterday that are the sinners of today. And the fact that Austria finds itself all of a sudden into the basket of the most affected countries, it tells you that even sort of the more thrifty member states can be affected by a shock like this. So I think that's an important change of narrative and has really changed a little bit the way Europe looks at the issue of solidarity and how member states should be helping each other during times of crisis.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it really depends also on the type of service. The service sector, I mean, obviously, Germany also has a big tourism industry, but nothing in comparison to Austria. And then, Germany has a lot of other services, like a lot of administrative employees and attorneys and what have you. And none of them were really laid off. Retail, different story, but it's a very complex mosaic of how these numbers come together. I personally think that the pent-up demand that you mentioned earlier will affect the tourism sector because, during the summer, for better or worse, people started traveling. My cousins in Spain were overrun with tourists from all over the place, which should have probably not have happened. But people are making travel plans once the vaccine, including myself, once the vaccine rollout has been really shown to make a difference. I want to get back on the automatic stabilizers that we have put in place in Europe and the lack thereof, or just your comment on if there is a chance that the US, now with the Biden administration, will take some of the steps that we have, or maybe, I don't know if it's politically possible, but maybe it's economically feasible to take some of these steps. Maybe the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage to $15 is one step in that direction. I would love to hear your thoughts on. I mean, I know you're talking to the IMF and the World Bank. How is that seen to how are we addressing the next pandemic if we're not stabilizing the economy overall? How are we going to be ready for the next crisis coming in?
So I will let Ben come in on this, maybe also because I make it sort of a point not to comment on U.S. economy. There are so many people that are more qualified than I am, but I would just like make a little bit, try to explain a little bit the mechanics, which I think it's not trivial. What happens with the short work schemes is, in fact, the employee remains linked to the firm. Their employment contract is not broken. The firm, and not the employee, the firm is the one who goes to the Social Security Fund and asks for the subsidies. The employee himself actually just continues to receive the wage. Most of the times 100%, sometimes it can be a bit lower than that. But that is basically the beneficiary, if you want, becomes the firm that distributes the money to the employee. For short period of time. That's why it's the short work schemes, and that's how these schemes were thought of. They were mostly engineered for the manufacturing sector that can have short period of interruption, and that's why they were so developed in countries which had a stronger manufacturing base. And there are definitely some advantages to this if you have a very short crisis, or if you have like a pandemic that it's a very deep recession and then a rebound. You just avoid those dislocations. On the other hand, these schemes do not work very well if you're trying to reallocate workers from one firm to another firm, from one sector to another sector, because it freezes them in that situation. So for the long term, if you want to see structural change, you want to see workers moving. You want them to move them from sector to sector, from firm to firm, and that sometimes requires the unemployment. That they go through a period of unemployment in order to look for another job. So this is just, I think it's important to have in mind these trade-offs. And then on the politics of how this could work in the U.S., I just give the floor to Ben.
Yeah. So I think that it's really useful to think about public policy measures in the context of politics, because I think otherwise you can get into comparing apples and oranges, and it really helps to understand why policymakers make the decisions that they do. So in the United States, you had very quickly the realization that social safety nets were not really equipped to deal with the kind of crisis that we had with the pandemic. And so things like the Paycheck Protection Program were sort of modeled on European short work schemes and designed to solve the same problem of you want to keep people in their jobs and attached to their employers as much as possible during this big shock. But then other aspects like raising the minimum wage, like giving people paid time off work, like making sure that health insurance is available and not just tied to your job. In the political system of the United States, you basically need 60 votes in the Senate to get those kinds of reforms passed, and you don't have them. You don't have the 60 votes. And so that is why the Biden administration is pursuing an enormous fiscal package with direct checks that maybe aren't as well targeted as economists would like, because that's politically what's feasible. In Europe, by contrast, the issue is that, there's lots of issues, but one that I'd like to highlight is that member states do not have the unlimited fiscal capacity that, for example, the United States does. And so if you are Italy, for example, you do need to worry about your overall debt to GDP levels and how big a deficit you can run for how long. And that is why the focus of European policymakers from the beginning was on preventing any kind of fragmentation in European sovereign debt or credit markets, and why they took so many measures to prevent that from happening and to make sure that banks could continue to lend and that you didn't see spreads blow out. And likewise, all these unemployment schemes that Europe has are expensive and they're administered by the member states. So that's why the European Commission created the SURE program to provide, a backstop for some of these benefits and make sure that countries would be able to fund the automatic stabilizers that were already in place. So if you look at it in that context, you can really see that Europe is really making incredible progress on addressing some of, the structural issues that have in the past caused fragmentation, caused there to be, the need for fiscal austerity and other kinds of measures. And that's by, increasing the fiscal capacity of the center, of the Commission, and of distributing funds out from the center to the member states. And so in that regard, I think that you can really favorably compare politically some of the things that have happened in Europe to the United States. Now, that's not to say that the US isn't doing a good job too. It's just that both sides, you have to think about what the constraints are, what political actors are capable of doing.
Yeah, but I have to say, it is a major difference if you can, as a company, if you can go to the bank and get money because the banks are stable and funded, then the Paycheck Protection Program, which gives you 2.5 months of payroll, which is not altogether that much. I mean, it's not the same stability that you have, and you don't know if you need to pay it back. It's not automatically forgiven. So it's kind of like a loan that you're getting from Washington, 2.5 months. And with a pandemic that has now, have we reached the 1-year mark? And now we're 2 weeks away from it. There's a large spread between the two of them.
Sure, it would have been better if the U.S. had short work schemes in place before the pandemic, but they didn't, and so this is what they came up with. It's maybe not a first best solution, but it's a second best solution, and I think a lot of policy making is that.
Yeah. I want to get back to the debt across the member states. Can you address that a little bit further and see how in the medium and long term we want to address that? Because obviously you can only have a certain debt level, before you get in trouble with being a European Union member. How is that going to develop looking forward? Are we going to raise that, or are we going to make exceptions? Is it coming down? Is it?
So let me try to unbundle that, because there are two parts, I think, to that question. One is how much debt is sustainable, and the other part is what would happen to the fiscal surveillance rules, or the fiscal rules that we have in place in the EU. So how much debt is sustainable? Of course, during the great financial crisis, in the Euro debt crisis, we worried a lot about that. But the interest rates were really high, and the perception that there was this risk of fragmentation that Ben alluded to before when we looked at the spreads, that made even lower debt levels look less sustainable. I think we have, substantially moved out of that environment because we understand, I mean, partly also because of all the things that were done during this period in between, in terms of, making the banking union, solidifying the capital market union within the EU, but then also having this talk about a central fiscal capacity, which has taken away some of those fear of fragmentation that really, shut up the spreads during the previous crisis. So I think, the sustainability part looks much better going forward. Country like Italy, it still remains very much of an issue, but as in the case of the US, I mean, I think that the issue is really now try to think of it in terms of how do you make sure that you have enough growth so that would basically bring that debt ratio down, right? As opposed to, I think we have also seen that, just trying to strangle public expenditure without really looking at what is causing the low growth, the weak growth, is not the right strategy. And that is also why this recovery and resilience facility is there. We maybe haven't spoken very much about the other components, because there are two pillars to that. One pillar is really the money, the financial incentives, which is going to be, quite transformative per se, because all the money can only be spent on investment, with the exception of education and active labor market policies. And moreover, this investment has to be, as transformational as possible in the green and in digital space, et cetera, et cetera. But the other pillar of that is the reform. And really, the deal that was done out of this in this situation was that member states, which are going to be net contributors to this, are willing to do this if Europe comes out as a whole much better out of this, right? And then basically everyone will benefit, and that's sort of and that's why the investment part and the reform parts have come together in this. What we see now is that member states, okay, arguably, they have been focusing a bit more on the spending part, on the spending plans for the moment, but they also have to come up with really a reform plan, a credible reform agenda, quite ambitious. And what we see now is that a country like Italy, for example, is with the new prime minister, is identifying really some of those bottlenecks to growth that we have been stressing and pointing at for years from the EU. We are talking about the reform of the justice system. We are talking about digitalization of the public administration. So all of these are hopefully a set of reforms that are going to unlock growth, and with higher growth, I think we shouldn't really care that much about the sustainability of the current debt levels, especially definitely not at the aggregate, but not even at the level of certain member states. Now, the fiscal surveillance part, what happens after the pandemic, it's just a whole different discussion. I mean, it's partly economics, but it's also part that it's grounded in the treaties. A discussion is ongoing, and there were, of course, a deficit element. There was a debt element into the fiscal surveillance rule. I think rules that we had before. I can already see that the debt part is going to be a little bit less important going forward. But this is actually the reflection was ongoing before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic has just made this reflection just more. The shock that we have witnessed has made this reflection much more important, much more present to have it, and I believe that we will see some changes going forward. Ben.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
One thing real quick, Ben, before you get to that, we have a survey that we're going to launch in a couple of minutes, seconds actually. But we will continue talking, and our audience, please do a comment on our questions. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that fiscal surveillance, like Chris was saying, is sort of on the to-do list of longer-term conversations that need to happen. And what I was going to explicitly mention was, in addition to possible changes to the fiscal rules, which we have to be a little bit careful talking about because it's such early days and we work for the Commission. The ECB is also currently conducting its own framework review, much like the Federal Reserve did in the United States. And so I think that, both fiscal and monetary policymakers are thinking hard about what kind of frameworks they should employ in making sure that they have the appropriate policy stance. And you're going to see some changes. I don't know exactly what they're going to be, but in the US, the Fed has much more emphasis on full employment and on having catch-up recoveries where they let inflation go a bit over 2% in order to make up for periods when inflation was too low. And so these are the same kind of conversations that are going on the European side of the Atlantic as well, and it'll be an interesting area to watch in the coming years.
Yeah, I have thank you. I have another set of questions that is related to supply chain. The spillovers across the global economy, because I completely agree. There will be some positive spillovers once Europe is back, once the US is back, how this all ties in with one another. And we've been doing a lot of programs on supply chain, and the supply chain is still severely disrupted. And when do you think that the vaccine rollout will make the difference that we need to bring supply chain back to normal levels? And with supply chain, I mean not only production of products or parts of products that go into other products that we are then selling, but I'm also talking about shipping, things across oceans. There's so much disruption on so many levels. I sometimes don't even know where to start. What do you think is going to kick that back into something that we could consider normal? And when will it take place?
This is a hard question. I'll leave it to Ben.
I know it's the crux of the matter, but it's a problem.
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question. I think that, obviously there are, I think that we should think about it in terms of what are the goals that we want? We want technology to solve a lot of the problems that we are facing. And we want businesses to be able to innovate and come up with new ways of delivering goods and services. And there's so many aspects to this question that it's hard to know where to start, because it intersects with economics and foreign policy and domestic politics. And so, when you're talking about supply chains, yeah, there's going to be some retrenchment of things that have national security spillovers that are just politically really important for lots of countries. But I think, more broadly, I think that it's still what we want is the private sector and universities to be, doing cutting edge stuff and making sure that we have the solutions for what happens tomorrow. And that ultimately is going to hopefully trump some of the political pressures to do things that would be more disruptive.
Yeah, maybe I'm just going to add on this. I think that indeed the pandemic has highlighted some vulnerabilities in supply chains, right? And we definitely had that in the some of the protection equipment, but we are seeing it also with the vaccine rollout. There are some chemicals production products that are reactants that are needed, and this has all sort of highlighted heightened a sense of vulnerability, especially in a pandemic or in other kinds of shocks. And so I think there is a little bit of a discussion going there, to maybe for certain output not try to making sure that you actually have some level of domestic resilience. Having said that, I think that we should not overblow this. The way supply chain are complex, but there is a reason why they're so complex, and this complexity is actually nothing that firms cannot deal with. What firms cannot deal with is the unpredictability of an environment, and that we see also what has made so much damage, especially during the trade conflicts that we had with the previous administration across the board, and that was just creating a very uncertain, a very unpredictable environment, and that was also hurting the supply chains. So I think we have here some negative, but we also have some plus coming. Hopefully a trade environment that is much more predictable, much more prone to ad hoc deals that are crafted at the last minute, and this would help our entrepreneurs, American entrepreneurs, to deal with the complexity, taking away some of that uncertainty away.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at the vaccine, one of the problems with the vaccine was that the containers that the vaccine is shipped in or stored in has a glass lining, and then all of a sudden there was a glass shortage. I mean, it was really, it comes out in the most minute things. But since we had said we would talk a little bit about Brexit, has Britain's pullout affected the overall EU recovery? Can we say that yet, or is it just too early to tell?
I mean, I think it's undeniable that it has affected it. I mean, our forecast, would have been much better if the UK was still a member state, and the UK's forecast would look a lot better if they were still part of the EU. So I think that there is clearly, this is an undeniable negative. It is again, we have patterns of regional variations. Some member states who had more intense trade relations with the UK have been affected more. But having said that, when we were in the previous forecast round, we were considering that the trade between the EU and the UK would revert to just pure WTO terms, with all that implies. I think that what we have now, with the UK-EU comprehensive trade and cooperation agreement is a fairly ambitious agreement, given what were some of the red lines that the UK had identified, and this is obviously the outcome of a political internal process, but there were some red lines, and this was probably one of the best outcome that we could have, given the constraints, political constraints on both sides. But from there to say that this is not a negative, has not a negative impact on the EU, no, this has a clear negative impact on the EU.
Yeah. In this context, last question before we run out of time. The short-term automotive outlook and longer-term electric transition, how is that going to impact the EU economy as a whole, and then also jobs? What do you think?
I'll take the first stab at that. I think it's too early to say, but I think that the way to think about it is risks, right? And there's both downside and upside risks. On the one hand, the automotive sector is hugely important to the European manufacturing base, and especially a few countries in Europe. And it's not just I don't think that we need to worry about what will happen to the BMWs and Mercedes of the world. It's more the suppliers, right? Because if you think about the technology that goes into cars, there's so many small businesses and medium-sized firms that make some particular widget, some gasket that goes into a gasoline engine or something like that. And even if big companies can manage the transition to having electric motors and creating new kinds of batteries and things like that, there's going to be a lot of disruption in the sector. And so there's opportunities because there's going to be new companies that create batteries and things like that. But it's also clearly a threat to some of the existing incumbents. And so we're going to have to see how that plays out. But it's happening. And you can already see that in several European countries, I think sales of electric cars have already surpassed sales of diesel vehicles. And so this is happening really quickly, and public policy is playing a role in terms of providing incentives for this sort of technological transition. And it's something that I think European policymakers and European business people want to make sure that European firms are really at the forefront of this. And so it's going to happen, and it's going to be disruptive, but the question is whether the positive benefits will outweigh the negative ones, and I think we should be cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think, and also the recovery plan, the EU recovery plan addresses some of those issues. So
yeah,
I'm actually.
I was going to come to that, because we see that a lot of investment in infrastructure could cover in that, and some member states are really thinking about, boosting their capacity to electrify cars, having car electrification points throughout the, having that network. And once you start having those network effects, then you can really see a very quick acceleration. I mean, people have still a little bit of what they call the range anxiety when it comes to electric cars, that, will my car have enough battery power to bring me from one point to another? But when you start seeing that there are actually electric fueling opportunities much more spread, then part of that anxiety is removed, and that is really, key, I think, to accelerate the transition.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very good, very good. I mean, I think my take home from the program is really, there is a lot of, in terms of innovation, will also drive, a lot of the pickup of the recovery. And we see that innovation in so many sectors has accelerated. I mean, forcefully so over the last 12 months. And I really think that we're just at the beginning of a real push towards that, towards more innovation, and how that is driving and changing sectors, changing how people do business with one another and what kind of business they do. Do you have a final comment?
I think we have been here long enough, and we should let everyone go back to their work.
Yeah, exactly. If we don't have any, and you can always, the audience, you can always send questions in. We can forward them to the panelists and get them answered for you. But so definitely glass half full, if not fuller. I always like to say a glass 3/4 full. But with that, thank you, everyone. This concludes our webinar today. And a quick reminder, we will make a list of the attendees available after the event. If you're a member and you would like to connect to any of the other participants, we will be happy to facilitate that. Again, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.